I never thought moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood would turn into a battle straight out of a courtroom drama, but from the moment I pulled into my driveway with the lease agreement in hand and the keys jingling in my pocket, I should have known trouble was coming, because there she was, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, arms crossed at the end of the cul-de-sac, glaring at me like I'd just stolen her crown, her lips pursed so tight they looked glued shut, and before I could even unload the first box from my truck, she marched straight over, clipboard in one hand, cell phone in the other, demanding to know what business I had, moving into her community without prior approval from the HOA board, as if she personally owned every inch of concrete in the neighborhood. I tried to be polite, explaining that I wasn't just some squatter. I had a signed lease, notarized, on file with the county. The rent was paid in full, and I had every legal right to live there. But the more calmly I explained, the more her face turned red, like she wasn't used to people standing up to her. And then came the line that set the tone for everything that followed. "Not on my watch." She spat those words like a sheriff in some old Western showdown, and from that moment on she made it her mission to drive me out by any means necessary, showing up unannounced with made-up violation notices, snapping pictures of my car as if parking on my own driveway was some sort of felony, and warning neighbors that I was breaking HOA law by daring to exist without her rubber stamp. I laughed it off at first, figuring she'd get bored or move on to harassing someone else, but Karen wasn't wired that way. She thrived on control, and I had just challenged it, so she escalated, telling anyone who would listen that my lease was invalid, that I was squatting, and that she was prepared to involve law enforcement if I didn't vacate voluntarily. The first time she said it, I thought it was just an empty threat. But then one evening as I was unloading groceries, headlights cut across my driveway, and 2 police cruisers rolled up, lights flashing, and out stepped 2 officers who looked as confused as I did when Karen stormed up behind them, shouting that I was illegally occupying the property and that she, as HOA president, was filing an official complaint. I'll never forget the way they looked at her, then at me, then back at the perfectly normal 2-story rental house, with my boxes inside and the lease papers I quickly produced, and you could see it written on their faces, "This woman is wasting our time." But Karen wouldn't stop, pacing up and down the sidewalk, jabbing her finger toward the house and shrieking about bylaws and unauthorized tenants like she was auditioning for a reality TV show, and I could feel the tension building in the air as more neighbors peeked out their windows, porch lights flicking on, people whispering on their lawns as if the spectacle were the night's entertainment. I was humiliated, furious, and yet strangely calm, because I knew she had overplayed her hand. And as I stood there under the flashing lights, lease in hand, I could already see the story shifting in my favor, not because of what the officers said that night, but because of what I was about to do next, the counter-move that would turn her harassment into a payday she never saw coming. The night the police came was the spark, but the real fire started the very next day, because Karen, humiliated that the officers hadn't dragged me off the property in handcuffs, doubled down like only a true HOA tyrant could. First came the barrage of violation slips shoved into my mailbox, each one more absurd than the last, accusing me of everything from improper garbage bin placement to unauthorized window treatments. And then came the emails, long rambling manifestos filled with pseudo-legal jargon where she threatened to fine me thousands of dollars for illegal tenancy and warned that the HOA board would pursue eviction through law enforcement. At first, I thought about ignoring her, hoping she'd burn herself out. But then I realized something critical. The lease I had signed wasn't just airtight. It had a clause in it that Karen, in her crusade to control everything, had completely overlooked. The landlord had rented the property to me at a discounted rate, but if the HOA, or anyone affiliated with them, interfered with my right to quiet enjoyment of the home, they would be held financially liable for damages, and the damages included a rent multiplier, triple rent, for the duration of the interference. When I read that clause again, my jaw nearly dropped, because Karen had not only interfered, she had called the police, tried to slander me to my neighbors, and had now put everything in writing in the form of those ridiculous violation letters. So instead of reacting emotionally, I went methodical. I called my landlord first, explained the situation, forwarded every letter and email, and his response was immediate. He was furious, not at me, but at the HOA, because this wasn't just harassment. It was a breach of contract that threatened his rental income. Within hours, he connected me with his attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who took one look at the paperwork and said, "They just wrote you a check." From that moment, everything changed. I began documenting Karen's every move like I was building a case file. Photos of her trespassing onto the property line to snap pictures of my flower beds, audio recordings of her shouting at me in front of neighbors, and every email saved in neat little folders. And here's the thing, the more I ignored her theatrics and kept living my life, the more unhinged she became, marching up and down the street with her clipboard like a mall cop on steroids, ranting about how she was taking the community back, while my neighbors, one by one, started to realize she wasn't protecting them, she was embarrassing them. The breaking point came when she tried to host an emergency HOA meeting on my front lawn, inviting residents to vote on whether I should be forcibly removed. But instead of support, she got eye rolls, chuckles, and eventually someone shouting, "Karen, go home." That was the moment I knew the tide had turned, not just in public perception, but in leverage. Because while she was burning social capital with her neighbors, I was quietly stacking legal ammunition. And when my landlord's attorney drafted a formal demand letter citing interference, harassment, and that sweet triple rent clause, it wasn't just a threat. It was a legally binding hammer ready to come down. The police might have laughed her off the first time, but now the law was on my side. And soon Karen was about to find out what it felt like to be the one cornered, staring down consequences she could never have imagined. The following week was a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and late nights reading legal jargon until the words blurred together. But every ounce of effort was worth it because the more I dug, the clearer it became. Karen had built her empire of intimidation on nothing but sand, and all it would take was one good shove to bring the whole thing crashing down. I started with the county clerk, driving downtown with a folder full of printed maps, old trust documents, and highlighted property lines. The clerk, a weary but helpful woman who had clearly seen her fair share of HOA disputes, raised an eyebrow when I laid everything out on her desk. "You're telling me your HOA is fining you for fishing on a lake they don't actually own?" she asked, flipping through the documents. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I said, "and I want to know how to fix that." She tapped her pen against the papers, then pulled up the digital registry. After a few clicks, she leaned back in her chair and gave me a look that was half amusement, half disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned. You're right, the title's never been transferred. Technically, it's still sitting in the original developer's trust. Which means," she paused for effect, "it's up for sale if you've got the money." My pulse quickened, my grip tightening on the folder. "How much are we talking?" She gave me a number that made my stomach flip. But I'd prepared for that. I wasn't rich, but I had savings, investments, and just enough stubborn pride to know this was worth every dime. "I'll take it," I said without hesitation. Over the next few weeks, I navigated the bureaucratic labyrinth like a man possessed, filing applications, paying fees, and waiting for approvals, all while Karen kept escalating her harassment. Every morning, a new fine appeared taped to my door. 2-0 for illegal fishing. 5-0 for endangering wildlife. Even one absurd 10-0 fine for destruction of HOA resources, which I could only assume meant daring to catch a fish on what she still insisted was her lake. Neighbors whispered about her antics, some rolling their eyes, others too afraid to speak up. But I kept my head down, my focus steady, because I knew something they didn't. Every fine she issued, every threat she made, was just another nail in the coffin of her crumbling authority. The day the deed finally came through, I stood outside the county office holding the papers in my hands, my name officially listed as the owner of the entire lake and surrounding access points. It felt surreal, like holding the keys to freedom, like staring down a tyrant with the ultimate weapon, truth backed by law. I drove straight home, parked by the cabin, and for the first time in weeks walked down to the lake without a knot of dread in my chest. The water sparkled in the afternoon sun. The breeze was calm, and when I cast my line, I knew I wasn't just fishing anymore. I was reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Of course, Karen didn't take long to find out. The very next day, she stormed down the path with 2 board members in tow, her face twisted into something between disbelief and fury. "You think you're clever?" she spat, waving a fine in my face. "You think a piece of paper means you can ignore community rules?" I didn't even flinch. I pulled the deed from my back pocket, unfolded it slowly, and held it up for her and her minions to see. "Not a piece of paper," I said calmly. "The piece of paper. This lake isn't yours. It never was. And now, it's mine." Her eyes darted across the document, the official stamps, the signatures, the undeniable seal of the county clerk. The color drained from her face, her lips quivering like she wanted to deny it but couldn't find the words. The board members exchanged nervous glances, clearly realizing they'd been backing a sinking ship. Karen's voice cracked as she tried one last desperate plea. You can't do this. You can't just take the lake away from the community." I folded the deed back into my pocket, leaned in, and said the words I'd been waiting weeks to deliver. "Watch me." The news spread faster than wildfire, and by the end of the week, every single resident in the neighborhood knew that I, the man Karen had been trying to bleed dry with bogus fines, now held the deed to the lake she had spent years pretending to control. Some people whispered in disbelief. Others chuckled behind closed doors, and a brave few even stopped by to congratulate me, shaking my hand with the kind of quiet respect reserved for someone who'd done what they only dreamed of doing, standing up to the tyrant and winning. But none of them were prepared for what came next, not even Karen herself. I waited until Saturday morning, when the lake was always busiest, kids running down with fishing nets, families spreading out picnic blankets, and of course Karen patrolling the shoreline like a self-appointed queen guarding her crown. I walked down calmly, deed in hand, my voice carrying across the water as I called out for everyone's attention. Neighbors paused mid-cast, mid-conversation, curiosity pulling them closer until a small crowd had gathered by the bank. Karen's smugness faltered when she saw the document in my hand, but she quickly plastered on a smile, certain I wouldn't dare challenge her in front of everyone. That's when I held the deed high and said, loud enough for all to hear, "This lake does not belong to the HOA. It never has. And as of this week, it belongs to me." Gasps rippled through the crowd, heads swiveling between me and Karen like spectators at a tennis match. She sputtered, waving her clipboard like a sword. "Don't listen to him. He's lying. The HOA rules." I cut her off with the crack of authority in my voice. "The HOA rules mean nothing here. I own this lake. The county has signed it over to me. I've got the legal deed right here, stamped and verified, which means effective immediately. HOA fines here are worthless. And from this moment on, the only rules are mine." Murmurs turned to outright laughter, people shaking their heads at Karen, some even clapping quietly, while she turned beet red, veins bulging in her neck as the truth suffocated her false power. And then, with deliberate calm, I delivered the hammer blow. Since this HOA has spent months trying to find me, harass me, and ban me from my own peace, I'm returning the favor. Effective today, all HOA members are banned from this lake. You step foot here, you're trespassing. Consider this your official notice. The eruption was immediate. Gasps, laughter, stunned silence all rolled into one. Karen nearly choked, her face contorting as she shrieked, "You can't do that. You can't ban us. This is a community lake." I stepped closer, my voice low but sharp enough for everyone to hear. "No, Karen, this is my lake. And after everything you've put me through, not one of you from that HOA is welcome here again." She screamed, she stomped, she threatened lawsuits and police calls. But the sheriff himself had already been looped in when I filed the paperwork, and he'd confirmed it was all airtight. The more she shrieked, the more foolish she looked, until even her own board members quietly slipped away, shaking their heads, leaving her isolated on the shore. The neighbors erupted into applause, laughter echoing across the water as Karen stormed back to her SUV, slamming the door so hard it rattled, peeling out with gravel spitting behind her like the tantrum of a child denied a toy. From that day forward, the lake became mine in every sense, not just legally, but symbolically. I fished in peace. Friends and family came by to enjoy the water, and those who weren't part of Karen's HOA were always welcome. As for the HOA, they could only stare bitterly from a distance, watching the lake sparkle in the sunlight, knowing it was forever out of their reach. Karen had tried to find me into submission, but instead, I bought the very thing she thought gave her power and used it to strip her of everything she'd built her empire on. And that, to me, was sweeter than any fish I'd ever catch.